Okay, everybody, this is Unit 1. The exam is called Work in the Private Security Industry, and this is the exam you'll have to complete on the final day of your course if you're attending an SIA qualification in either door supervision or CCTV. The exam is actually the same for both door supervision and CCTV. So if you do a door supervision course, you can actually, in fact, be exempt from doing the exam in a CCTV qualification, and it's exactly the same the other way around. The section itself, as I said to you, is made out of 6 separate modules. We're going to start off with a brief introduction to the private security industry, and we're going to go through a little brief history, where it comes about, etc., etc. Okay, so there was no requirement for any kind of training in the 80s. On the back end of the 80s, there was a couple of cases that came forward to the police. The police started to look into it, and around the sort of late 80s, they started looking at running a project to do with licensing and getting licenses for people working in door work and also working in other areas of security. This culminated in about early 90s where they ran a test project where they got 2 councils to run a licensing program. Now, what this required was that anybody working in private security in a certain sector had to be licensed to work in that sector. If they weren't licensed, they couldn't work in that sector, and it was dealt with on a local government level. So that takes us through to about 1999, where they started to look at, let's not do this on a local level, let's get national legislation, which then will cover the entire of England and Wales, and let's get that now enforced going forward. So in 1999, a white paper was passed through Parliament. This was then voted into law and became the Private Security Industry Act of 2001. Now, this act stipulates very strongly about the background of the person working in the industry, the training they need to have, and also criminal record checks, etc. This means that wherever they're trained in England and Wales, they need to be trained to the same level. To oversee all of this, the government brought together a group of private security companies, and they started looking at forming a group called SIA, which is the Security Industry Training Organization. They later came to be known as Skills for Security. Now, they came up with the training side of things. So they came up with what was required as far as your training is concerned going forward. The enforcers of the law is the Security Industry Authority, also known as the SIA. It is their responsibility to make sure that all licensing is done according to law. They also make sure that all licensing is done correctly. Anybody working in the industry is working correctly and is licensed to do so. They also will carry out inspections, and pretty much from the beginning of your course, which is starting now, all the way through to the time when you're working under a license, they are pretty much the people we're answerable to. All of us working with licenses all are answerable to the SIA. Not just the SIA, we're also answerable to all law as well in the UK. So the key purpose of the Private Security Industry Act of 2001 is the protection of people and property. So that's not only the protection of people who are working in the industry, but also those who are affected by their acts and omissions. The SIA's job, as I said, is to enforce the legislation. The SIA is an autonomous body which reports to the Home Secretary. They deal with all licensing issues. They issue your license as well as carry out inspections. Current licenses include door supervision, security guarding, CCTV Operator, close protection, and CVIT. Now, CVIT is cash and values in transit. Majority of those courses can be attained by doing the course through your employer if you're going to work as a cash handler, moving valuables from A to B. All right, the first thing that they do love to ask a question on, and it comes up quite often, is the 3 ways that security is provided. So security is provided in 3 fundamental ways. We have man security, which is you, anybody wearing a badge, any human basically doing the job comes under man security. Then we have physical security. So what we're referring to there is referring to locks on doors, any kind of physical barrier that somebody would have to get through in order to get into a property, for example. The last type is system security. Now, system security is referring to CCTV systems, alarm systems, and this also includes your fire alarms, intruder alarms, and all of those kind of things. So what is expected of you when you're working in the industry? Well, firstly, if you're licensed, the SIA and your employer expect you to be calm, somebody who is able to be watchful, somebody who's able to look at a situation and deal with it under pretty much any circumstances in a calm and rational manner. Some of the sort of key skills that they're looking for you to bring is honesty, trustworthiness, reliability, timekeeping. If you imagine that you're going to work in an industry where perhaps you're on a shift, you're going to start your shift at approximately 7 o'clock in the evening. Well, there's a shift previous to you. So if you turn up 15, 20 minutes late, what's going to happen then is that previous shift is going to have to continue to work until you get there. So very quickly, you're not going to make any friends in the industry. Also, if you're working on licensed premises, it may be a stipulation in the license where you're working that all security need to be on site at a specific time. If you're running late and you happen to be inspected, as in the premises happens to be inspected, this could have major consequences for the venue and could end up in them getting a heavy fine, or perhaps even getting shut down because they don't have the correct security on site when they should have. As mentioned previously, there are currently a number of sectors already covered under the SIA licensing scheme, and with new ones potentially coming on board in the future. Door supervisors. Now, door supervisors are commonly thought of as people who are working in front of a door of a nightclub. But the license allows you to do more than just that. In fact, the license is probably more versatile than any other license that they have, not including the close protection license. With a door license, this allows you to work anywhere where alcohol is consumed, but it also allows you to work in areas where alcohol is not consumed. It covers pretty much everything the security guard license covers, except for where alcohol is sold and consumed. Now, it's important you understand that consumed is the key point here. As a security guard, you could work at Tesco's, which is licensed to sell alcohol. However, if you worked at a nightclub, consumption happens on site. Therefore, a door supervision license would be required, not a security guard. A security guard is not allowed to work where alcohol is consumed. Security guard or security officer is licensed to work mainly front of house reception security. It could also be looking after a building at night. They can also work in retail, looking after shops, trying to stop shoplifting happening and just carry out basic security there. They can also look after sites, as I said, at night. They can do car park security, that kind of thing. However, again, going back to door supervision, they are not licensed to work anywhere where alcohol is consumed. So if you were working somewhere and there was drinking allowed and people were drinking alcohol on site, then that would preclude a security guard from working, and there would have to be door supervisors working on site. Key holders. Now, working as a key holder basically means you're going to lock up a property and look after the keys and the property until, say, the end of a night. So let's say a shop closes or a building closes at 7 or 8 p.m. Instead of being on site looking after that site, you may have 6 or 7 different sites that you're looking after over a night. Now, any alarm goes off, you would then report that to the police and you would arrive on site to do an inspection. That includes your fire alarms, that includes any kind of a burglar alarm or anything like that. There is no license itself for key holders. However, you would need to have a security guard license as a minimum to work as a key holder. As mentioned before, cash and values in transit, or CVIT as a license, is for people working in cash. These are normally people transferring cash or valuables between 2 points. They are licensed by the SIA, but as mentioned previously, you would actually be trained by a company that you worked with in order to get that license. CCTV operators also require a license to work anywhere with a surveying public space. Now, what do they need a license for? Essentially, a lot of the licensing is covering the law. So it's covering what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do when tracking somebody on camera. Anytime you can track somebody's movement on camera, zoom in and get their personal details, i.e. their images, their face, where they're going, what they're doing, you need to have a fairly good structured knowledge of the law, because you need to know when you're stepping over the boundary over what is acceptable and what is not acceptable under law. So we, just like with the use of force working as a door supervisor, it's pretty similar to that when you work as a CCTV operator. You also have to understand that the use of force of carrying out that surveillance has to be deemed as reasonable. So the course itself will cover things like reasonable use of cameras, what you can record, what you can't record. Also very much in depth on report writing, because most of what you do will require you to write reports. Close protection operatives. Now close protection operatives are the guys that you probably know better as bodyguards. Now in order to get a course to do that, you would go on a 14-day course, which is the minimum required hours in order to become a close protection operative. In that course, you would go through dealing with a principal or a single person that you're looking after, or maybe a group of people that you're looking after in any kind of environment. That might be anything from a business person, a celebrity, or it could be working overseas in a hostile environment. Now, all of those things would be covered on the course itself. These courses vary anything from 14 days to 21 days. Some of them can go up to 6 weeks, depending on exactly what kind of environment you'd like to be trained in to work in. The qualities of a security operative are very important. So not only having a badge and wearing it and having it on display at all times, which is a requirement under the Private Security Industry Act of 2001, you also have to look the part. So you may be given a uniform to wear, or you may just be told what to wear. So on a door, for example, they might just give you an outfit that you've got to wear: dark trousers, dark shirt, and dark jacket. Perhaps a tie, perhaps not a tie, depending where you work. Whereas if you're working more retail or something like that, they might actually have a uniform for you, which you would then get as part of your equipment that you would receive when you start working there. It might have the company name on it. It might have high visibility jacket or something like that. It may require you to wear personal protective clothing, again, depending on the environment that you're working. Above all of this, though, you have to be professional. That is the whole point of it, is you're a professional person and you're acting as such. Clients and members of the public both expect a certain level of behavior, professional behavior from you as a professional security officer. There are many career opportunities within the private security sector, which is what you guys are all going to be involved with. The more licenses you have and the more qualifications that you have make you more employable within our sector. So this is something you need to think about carefully when working in our industry. Never stop adding to your CV. What you want to do is look at further qualifications that best suit the job role that you're going into. Also remember, you can open up further opportunities by doing additional qualifications. For example, if you wanted to work as a security officer who also has to look at cameras on CCTV, you would have to have both a CCTV license as well as a door supervisor license or a security guard license in order to do this. Currently, there are over 1 million licenses in operation. There's a huge turnover of people. A lot of people do the job for a small amount of time and then come back to doing something else. They might be studying, they might be doing anything. There's quite a high turnover in security, as well as people go on to different career paths within the industry. Also, don't think that there's only one job available. Do your research, have a look. There's loads and loads of jobs out there, perhaps something you've not thought of before. For example, you could work anything from front of house reception security to film set security to anything in between. If you're working third party, you are required to have a SIA license. If you're working in-house security, you may be employed directly by a shop, for example, as security. You may not be required to have a license. It's very important that you understand where you're working and what the legal requirement is where you are. When working in the security industry, we're working with a number of key bodies. Most obvious one being the police. We're part of the larger police family and work closely with them in a lot of areas in security. In fact, in a lot of areas where the police numbers are being cut, private security is having to step in to assist the police more and more. Other local areas that we work with is, of course, the local councils. If you're working on any licensed premises, you will be working directly under the local licensing laws and the Licensing Act of 2003, which is the alcohol license, which is enforced by the local authority. You would also potentially be working as part of a radio scheme where all the pubs, clubs and bars may be linked via a radio scheme. which would then link back to the council and their CCTV operators. And this is all done in an effort to prevent and deter crime and protect the public. We also obviously have British standards. British standards are obviously in charge of setting legal standards that have to be met working in our sector. We have British standards numbers attributed to the qualifications that you do. Now in your exam, they're not going to go into that kind of detail asking for British standards numbers, but just so you're aware, British standards are obviously involved in the sector at one level or another. We also have the National Security Inspectorate and some others as well involved in our industry. The primary ones, the ones you need to be most worried about obviously, are the local authority, the SIA, and of course the police. Those are the ones that are going to have the biggest bearing on you working in our industry. Going back to the SIA is in charge of the mandatory licensing of all individuals working in the private security industry. They're also in charge of keeping a register, which is a public document, so anyone can go online and look up and see what licenses any other person holds. There's two ways to do this. One would be by searching a name, and the other would be by searching a license number. The idea behind this is that no one can run away and hide after they've done something potentially naughty whilst wearing their license and having it on display. Remember, it's compulsory that when you're working, you do have your license on display. So I couldn't wear my license somewhere where I was hiding it below a jacket. I would need to have it on display. For most sectors, there are a couple of examples where this is not a requirement, but that is beyond the scope of this course at the moment. Okay, so the SIA themselves will then be able to carry out their own investigations should anyone have done anything wrong. The ACS, or Approved Contractor Scheme, is also managed by the SIA. This is awarded to any company that meets the standards set by the SIA in order to achieve this. They will also be registered on the SIA's database, and it's actually a good place for you guys to go and look for potential work in the future. So in all, licensing checks that the security operative is fit and proper to do the job in the sector that they've been licensed. Okay, getting your license. Well, you're already on your way to potentially getting your license right now. First thing you have to do is you have to go through this presentation. Once you've done that, you have to attend the course. You have to attend the full course, so that's full hours that are required, which varies from course to course, and you would be notified this when you were to book onto one of the courses. You have to then provide evidence of who you are and where you live. Documents required will be sent to you as well, but it's things like your driver's license, your passport, utility bills, etc. Now, these are used to prove who you are. You also would have to pass a criminal history check. Now, that would not be done as part of your training, but will be done by the SIA as part of your license application. If you've moved around a lot in the last 5 years, you would need to then supply evidence of where you've lived during the last 5 years. If you've lived in the same place, you'd still need to supply evidence as to where you've lived, and this would all be used as part of your checks. Now, as far as how long does it take to get your license, that can vary from applicant to applicant, depending again if you've moved around a lot and if you've got a complex history of moving or perhaps criminal history. Now, criminal history does not necessarily mean that you won't get a license, but it does mean the SIA are going to know about it and potentially investigate further. Licenses are granted on a case-by-case basis, and you can appeal the decision as well if you feel that the decision is not fair. A fee is also payable to the SIA. Currently, the fee stands at £220. So the process is you'll go on a course, you'll achieve the qualification by passing all your tests. Again, they vary how many tests you have from course to course, depending on the qualification. Once you've achieved that, you will then be notified. Once you've been notified about passing your course, you can apply for your SIA license. To start this, you can head over to the SIA website. You may be asked to go to a post office to complete the application. What would then happen is you would go and attend the post office, you'd take all your IDs with you, and on arriving they will then take a digital photo of you. That photo will be actually the photo that is used on your license. It will also be compared to the photo that you gave your training provider when you went on your course in the first place. So make sure that the photo that you give is up to date and it looks like you, and you don't change drastically between the two photos, otherwise this can cause a problem for you during your application process. Any photo that was taken in the last year or so, and as long as you haven't changed your face drastically, i.e. had a massive beard and then shaved it off, or had long hair and now shaved your head, that should be fine. So there shouldn't be any bothers. Remember that it also has to be a UK passport standard photograph. So that's the correct size, plus a background similar to the background with me here, with you looking straight forward towards the camera when taking it. You shouldn't have any headwear on, you shouldn't have your glasses on, and you shouldn't be smiling. This is your second module. This is called Communication Skills and Customer Care. So what this is going to go through is how to talk to people and how to deal with your customers and keep them happy. A lot of this actually does overlap into a later section of the course, which you'll be taught when you're on the course itself, and that is conflict management. Dealing with conflict situations. Well, if you deal with your customers correctly in the beginning, you can minimize the amount of conflict that you actually have to deal with. Okay, so let's get started. When you're working frontline, you're going to be dealing with the customers a lot. You're going to be dealing with the general public a lot. So you need to know how to talk to people and how to effectively communicate with these people. Now, some of these people might be angry, they might be upset, they may need your help, it might be an emergency. So your ability to communicate is vitally important. Now, basic communication is very straightforward. There's just three elements to it. There is a sender, there is the message itself, and there is the receiver. Now, in some situations, you might encode a message and a receiver might then have to decode the message. Now, this might be just standard communication, or it might be you're passing information over a radio to a colleague of yours. It also might mean that you're passing information off to the general public. It's important that the understanding is there from both parties. In other words, if I ask you to do something for me, I need to be sure that you understood what I meant and that you're going to carry out the task that I assigned you. If I didn't check that you understood, I made a mistake. But if you didn't understand and didn't ask me, you made a mistake. Now, it's all very well and good if we work together. But if I'm dealing with the general public, it's up to me to make sure that the general public have understood exactly what I'm saying and therefore can do what I've asked them to do. How we communicate. When we communicate, there's three basic ways that we communicate. The first one would be obvious, which would be spoken. Now, when I speak, I'm giving you information. However, if we break that down, what we're actually doing when we're speaking is we're doing what I'm doing right now, which is body language. So if it's a face-to-face meeting and I'm talking to you, I can be sending signals with my body language. For example, if I'm stood with my hands or arms folded like this when talking to you, that's negative. It's blocking. It's actually seen as an aggressive stance, and perhaps I'm not interested in what you have to say, and I'm just not really interested in you at all. At the same time, if I'm pointing my finger at you, that can be seen as even more aggressive and could easily lead to an escalation of the situation. So that's body language. Now, a huge amount of understanding comes from body language. Now, the words we use, they're actually the smallest part of the communication process. If we look at the breakdown of percentages, it's the smallest by far. Part of the understanding comes from the words used, which is a bit surprising for a lot of people. But in a face-to-face situation, this is actually how it works. The tone is kind of the middle. So we have body language being the biggest, tone being in the middle, and words being right down at the bottom. So how I say something to you will impact your understanding. So if I said, "Hey, how you doing? Come here," that sounds like a question. But if I say, "Hey, how you doing? Come here," that's a command. Now that changes your understanding of the situation quite fundamentally. We also have written communication, and written communication is anything from a shift handover, where I'm ending my shift and I want to pass important information on to a colleague or colleagues of mine, to written statements all the way up to an MG11 police statement. These are very important, and obviously in your courses, whatever course you're doing, the likelihood is you're going to go into quite a lot of detail as to how to write a statement correctly, as this is fundamentally one of the most important things you'll have to do. In any form of security, writing a statement is something that you will have to do, if not every day, quite often during your working life. So if we break down communication, we can break it into two sections. We can break it into verbal communication, which is your words and tone, and then we can break it into body language, which we've gone through previously. As I said, most of the understanding in a face-to-face scenario comes from the body language. Now, we can inadvertently upset people by giving off the wrong signals. So we've got to just remember, what are we doing with our hands? What are we doing with our arms? Are we standing too close? All of these things are very important. Now, you don't want to stand too close to somebody for a number of reasons. Obviously, one of the most important ones is to not get yourself in danger. If this is a member of the public, we don't know who they are, we don't know what they're capable of, and we don't know what their intention is. I also don't want, on the flip side, upset them or make them feel scared for any reason if I'm standing too closely to them. Anybody you don't know who's standing too closely will trigger a fundamental part of your brain where your brain is going to start to think fight or flight. We'll again look at that in more detail in the conflict management section with your course instructor. The importance of communication in the workplace is, of course, vital to getting the job done correctly. If I'm doing a shift and during my shift, say it's a night shift, I find something's not functioning correctly or something like that, I need to write a full statement or report and hand it over to the next shift that starts. Now, this is called a shift handover. It's not necessarily an incident, but it is something that needs to be passed across to the next shift that starts. If I don't do this correctly, a fault can go unfixed for quite some time. In fact, our security could be weakened by the fact that maybe a floodlight's not working outside that was never reported. So without effectively communicating that across to the next shift, you are going to find that the team is unable to do their jobs effectively. Of course, communication comes in many forms, and you may be someone quite senior in a company, or you might be somebody who's fairly junior. All members of the team have the right to be treated with dignity and respect, and everybody's point of view should be respected. From a customer point of view, everyone you come across is a customer essentially. It might be a customer internally, i.e. somebody you work with, or it could be an external customer, i.e. a member of the public, or a body that actually deals with you externally to your own members of staff. So visitors to the site, police personnel, etc. So if we break it down to internal and external customers, it's quite straightforward. An internal customer is anybody that you work with, so on a day-to-day basis, possibly employed by the company you work for, or even a third-party company, but they're on site pretty much every day. So those could be co-workers, management, anything like that. That's all seen as internal customer. An external customer would be somebody who's not on the site every day, somebody who's potentially visiting the site. It could be anyone from emergency services personnel, police or ambulance crew, somebody doing deliveries, or anything like that. So they're not based on our site, they're external to the site and they're just visiting the site. This includes the general public. It's important to note that we're going to deal with a lot of different people, and these customers can be quite diverse. Now, why do people become diverse? Why is there a difference in people? Well, it could be anything from where you were brought up, where you were born, what country you may be from, what your perception of the world around you is from your parents' point of view. So this can, your family's beliefs, this can all be pushed across onto you when you're very young. So this initial sort of outlook on the world can be very one-sided because you're only actually surrounded by very immediate people. As you grow up and grow older, you go out, you go to school, you learn more about the world. You can be impacted more by friends, external sources. Obviously, media, social media can drive people in a certain direction, etc. And as you grow older, hopefully you learn to question more things and so on. But what we're getting to is that everybody's an individual and everybody's different. People have different likes and different dislikes, and it's important for us to understand that you can't please everybody, but we're going to try our hardest to remain professional at all times and be as fair as we can when dealing with any customers. As security professionals or anybody dealing with customers, we need to take into account different people's values and try and find a way of getting an understanding building a rapport between us and our customers, and finding the best solution to their particular problem and best way of handling their problem. So looking at the pictures to follow, how would you treat these two customers differently? Have a little think about how you would deal with these two individuals in potentially very different circumstances. Remember, customer care is a service that we're offering individuals, and as everyone's different, it's important that we vary how we deal with people. Now, empathy is very important when dealing with anybody who's emotional. Now, emotional could mean that they're very angry, very upset. Perhaps they're actually in a state where they're crying. Especially with alcohol, this can cause this to happen. So having the ability to put yourself in somebody else's position is very, very important. Try and see things from a customer's point of view and see if you can understand what it would feel like if you were that customer. How would you like to be treated? You want to treat the person in the way that you would like to be treated. When dealing with customers, it's important to leave them feeling that you've done your utmost to help them. So, if you can go the extra mile to help your customer, this is very important because it will help us potentially in the future when dealing with that customer or other customers. For example, if I went out of my way to help somebody, what that could do is have long-reaching effects on the business that we're representing. Remember, when you are working, you're out there and you're representing some form of business. It may be the security company you're working for, but it might be a larger organization that you are representing through the security company that you're working for. Okay, now that we've looked at the positives, let's talk about the negatives. Okay, so poor customer care, what can that lead to? Well, in the extreme cases, that can lead to a physical situation. So if you were feeling as a customer you weren't being taken seriously, it might lead you to get angry. Now, anger could then venture off and become aggression, which could then, in extreme cases, become violence. We need to stop that right at the beginning. So if we're helping the customer, we need to make that customer feel like they are valued. Poor customer care would be the opposite of that. It would be me not really showing much care, no empathy on my part, maybe making fun of you, laughing at you because you stood in a queue for a long time and now you can't come in because you got the wrong shoes on or something like that. These are all very negative things and will probably lead to an escalation of a situation. It's also poor customer care and is a very poor reflection on the company that you're working for. Good and efficient communication is very important when dealing with customers. Try to talk to customers on a level that they will understand. Everybody's different, so we'll try and find the level that works best for that customer. Also remember, first impressions normally last the longest. So what people see first is how they're going to judge you. It can take a hell of a long time to change somebody's perception on what they've picked up initially when they met you. So create a good first impression, look smart, greet customers, make eye contact, smile, see how you can help them, develop empathy, develop rapport with them. Rapport is putting yourself on a level, sort of building a relationship with the customer. Obviously, again, going back to what I spoke about a lot earlier, being dressed for the part is important. People firstly need to understand that you work there. So if you turn up to work and you're wearing jeans and a t-shirt, it's going to be very hard for people to understand that you're actually working there. What you need to do is be uniformed in a way that people can understand that you're actually on duty. Of course, having your license on display is a requirement under the SIA's Private Security Industry Act of 2001. All customers just want to be dealt with fairly at the end of the day. They want to be given treatment as if they are the only customer in the room. As you know, if you go in with a complaint or an issue, when you get to the front of the queue, you want to be treated as if you're not one of many, but you are the most important person in the room. So just bear that in mind when you are dealing with customers. Okay, everybody, now we're going to have a look at our third module, which is the law section. So there's two sections on law. This will be kind of the introduction to law, and this is going to give you a breakdown of the very basic general terms when it comes to law. Later on, when you're actually doing your course, it'll get a little bit more specific and there'll be more details passed across to you. Okay, so in the UK, there's two main types of law. There is civil law and there is criminal law. Now, we'll go through both of those individually, but essentially, the one we're more interested in security, is criminal law. Civil law does come into play a little bit, but most of the times we'll be dealing with people breaking the law on a criminal level. And that will be involving us calling the police and dealing with it that way. So if I break it down a little further, if we look at criminal law will always involve the police. So what will happen in a criminal case is a crime is committed. We as security would then have to pass that information across to the police. Police would attend the scene. Police would then investigate. Upon investigation, initial investigation, they may carry out arrests. And later, if they believe they have enough evidence, they may then charge. Once the police have then charged, this will then be passed across to the Crown Prosecution Service. Once the Crown Prosecution Service get the case, they will then make a decision as to what to prosecute for. For example, they might agree with the police's charge, or they might decide to charge for a slightly lesser offence. With the CPS, or Crown Prosecution Service, they normally go for a slightly lower charge than what the police would like to charge for. But this is actually way beyond what you guys are interested in. For us, all we're interested in is presenting the evidence to the police in the best possible way, as sufficiently as possible, and also preparing most likely a statement for the police as well. Civil law. Now, civil law covers a issue between two private parties. This could be anything from I disagree with the way I've been treated as a member of staff, and I want to go to a tribunal and get some kind of compensation. Now, generally speaking, a civil matter ends in restitution through compensation. So either assets or financial means are paid from one party to another party. There's no police involvement in a civil matter at all. It is purely based on the civil courts. Police will not carry out an arrest. It will not go to the CPS. It's nothing to do with the police at all. From our point of view of security, there's very little we can do in a civil matter as well. Essentially, one of the tricky ones is trespass, because that is a civil matter, but I will go through that a little bit later with you, and you will also learn more about that on the course when you're on your course. So just breaking down criminal law again, when we look at criminal law, we also have two branches of criminal law. We have common law and we have statute law. Common law is basically past cases that have been passed through the justice system over hundreds of years and have built up basically the framework of the law, also known as law of the land. Criminal law has also got the other side, which is statute law. Now, statute law is very easy to tell because any statute law has the word act at the end of it. An act means to breach that would be breaking the law and committing a criminal offence. So the Private Security Industry Act of 2001, if you breach any of the rules and regulations in that act, you are committing a criminal offence and can face anything from fines to potentially, in serious cases, potential jail terms as well. Within the criminal justice system, there are two types of court. One of them will be dealing with the lesser offences, and this is called the magistrate's court. And the second court is dealing with the higher offences, so the more punishable, more serious offences, and this is called the Crown Court. Now, if you're in a situation where you're tried in the magistrate's court, it's generally going to be a minor offence, traffic offences, things like that. The maximum sentence is going to be fairly small. The maximum sentence a magistrate can give is 12 months normally, which means 6 months served. Fines are also limited in the magistrate's court. When moving across into the Crown Court, obviously the maximum sentence is life and the maximum fine is unlimited. How do I know which court I'm going to go to? Well, hopefully you're not going to go to any court, but if you're going to go to court as a witness, the seriousness of the offence is going to dictate which court you're going to go to. In general, witnesses will go to a Crown Court, but this is not every case. The case that goes to the Crown Court is called an indictable case. Now, an indictable case or an indictable charge is one that is more serious and will have a higher sentence attached to it. A summary case is the case that will go to the magistrate's court. Now, in law, there's not very many pure indictable cases. In other words, a type of case where no matter what, you're going to go to the Crown Court. Things like murder and serious sexual offences, rape, etc., those will go directly to the Crown Court as they are purely indictables. But a lot of cases are called either way offences. So an either way offence means that it could be charged through a summary offence, or it could be charged through an indictable offence. And this will be based on the circumstances, the situation the person's been in, their history, their background, etc., etc. That would deem which type of offence they would be charged with, whether it's a summary, so it's a first offence and it was kind of a minor offence, or a more serious offence and perhaps the person's not learned their lesson from previous times, and they're now going to the Crown Court. A Crown Court can also deal with sentencing. If the magistrate deems that the crime was harsh enough that they cannot handle the sentencing themselves, they can always push it through to the Crown Court for sentencing. Some examples of criminal offences, pure indictables are your more serious ones. So we're looking at things like murder, kidnap, things of that nature, rape, serious sexual assault. They would fall under a indictable offence. But theft, for example, will fall under an either way offence, because it depends on what you've stolen, where you've stolen, what circumstances are involved. For example, if I stole a packet of crisps from a shop, I'm unlikely to go to jail for 10 years. But if I went into a bank and stole £1,000, £10,000, or £1 million, likelihood is in that situation I would end up under indictment in a Crown Court and potentially getting a far heavier sentence than, say, a shoplifter. Although if you look at the actual offence, it is still theft. However, don't confuse theft with robbery, because robbery is theft using force or threat of force. So if you had a packet of crisps and I said, give me your packet of crisps, it changes the offence from a theft, where your back was turned and I took it, into a robbery, where I've made you feel if you didn't give it to me, there would be circumstances. Civil laws, just a few examples of civil laws. Anything from employment tribunals, anything from family courts, trespass falls under civil, employment law falls under civil. So these are the type of things that you would deal with on a civil matter, which, as I said, from a security point of view, you're not generally going to be dealing with these kind of things yourself. Now, speaking of trespass, trespass is simply entering a building or part of a building without permission, or perhaps remaining on a building when you've been asked to leave and therefore permission has been withdrawn. In this situation, it is actually a civil matter, unless there are some circumstances attached. And again, this is getting a little bit in depth, but you can get criminally charged for a type of trespass. This is called trespass with intent. Also, aggravated trespass. Now, aggravated trespass is referring to somebody who's maybe protesting. They've got into your place of business and they've disrupted your legal workflow. So, in other words, they're against what your company represents. However, your company's not doing anything illegal. They're now disrupting you by entering your premises and stopping you from working. This is called aggravated trespass, and actually does come as a criminal offence, and a person can be charged under that offence. When dealing with trespassers, it's important to remember the first thing to always do is ask somebody to leave. Now, when we use reasonable force, we've got to justify our action. So if I was to simply grab somebody and move them without asking them to move, this could be most likely seen as unreasonable use of force. So what we need to do is firstly give them the chance to walk away on their own. Okay, guys, something we've also got to look at is human rights. So when we deal with people, we need to understand our rights, but we also need to understand their rights. This especially is important if we had to detain somebody. Let's say you're working in security and you had to detain somebody for shoplifting. They do have rights, and we're not allowed to breach any of those rights. If we breach their rights, we could be committing a crime ourselves. So we've got to be very careful not to step on the wrong side of the law here when we're trying to do our job. So the easiest way to do that is to know the rights that you could infringe and be very aware of those so that you don't accidentally infringe them. Remember also that naivety of the law is no defense in court. In other words, you can't say, I didn't know I wasn't allowed to do that. That would not give you any right to hurt somebody, even if you did it accidentally. That wouldn't be a defense, essentially, in court. So the Human Rights Act of 1998, it's very important that we are very au fait with the terms on that act, so we know all about the terms on that act. Okay, and especially the articles. So each article is the right to something, which every human under that act has these rights. Okay, so as I said, there are 14 fundamental rights, but of which we're only really interested in probably about 3 or 4 from our point of view. The most obvious one, the right to life. Now everyone would think that would be Article 1, but it's not. It's actually Article 2. So Article 2 of the Human Rights Act is the right to life. So you cannot put somebody's right to life in jeopardy at any time. You have no right to ever do that. And if you were to do that, or they felt like their human right was being somehow breached, that might give them good reason to respond potentially aggressively or even violently towards you. So some of the articles there are less likely to worry us. More importantly, we need to look at Article 6, which is a right to a fair trial, and Article 8, if you're doing surveillance, which is right to privacy. Article 14 is another one that could potentially interest us, and that is the prohibition of discrimination. So in other words, you cannot discriminate against somebody based on either their gender, ethnicity, race, religion, etc., etc. So we've got Article 2, right to life, Article 6, right to a fair trial, and Article 8, the right to privacy. These are the ones that we need to take careful care to pay attention to. Moving on from human rights, we also have something else to consider, especially if you're going to work in surveillance or anywhere where data is involved, and that is the DPA, or Data Protection Act of 1998. Now there is new legislation coming out sort of mid-2018, which will adjust and tweak some of the legislation that is covered under the DPA of 1998. However, fundamentally, it still remains pretty much true. Okay, so that means that how we collect data, what we do with the data, how long we possess the data, all of this is covered under the Data Protection Act of 1998. How you protect that data is very important as well, and you can be prosecuted, and companies can be prosecuted if they were to leak data, sell data, or not protect data correctly. So although the law doesn't say how long you can possess data for, it does state clearly that data should not be kept for any longer than is necessary. So in other words, you should not keep data for any longer than you have to. Now you might need to, where you work, keep data for X amount of years, and of course if that's written into the reasoning behind that, whatever it might be, then of course you can keep it. But what you can't do is just say, oh, we'll keep data for as long as we need to. That isn't actually good enough under the Data Protection Act of 1998. Now the ICO is the Information Commissioner's Office, and they're the people that deal with anything data related. Just like the SIA, Security Industry Authority, deals with anything security related, the ICO deal with anything data related. So any breaches of the Act, the ICO would be the people that investigate and then potentially prosecute anybody for doing that. Now there are potential fines and terms of imprisonment for people caught breaching the Act. So any company that is holding data needs to follow the rules of the Data Protection Act of 1998 in how it is stored and what they use it for. Also, all data that is held needs to be registered with the ICO as well. So the purposes, how you're going to store it, all of that needs to be registered with the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office. As security, again, this is probably outside of your domain. Somebody else would have done this, but of course you'll probably have to sign a disclosure which states that you're not going to share any information that is confidential in nature. Remember, anything that can identify a person would be seen under the Data Protection Act as personal data. That includes images, names and addresses, all of those kind of things. Any loss of data also has to be reported both to the police if it was a situation where data has been stolen, and of course to the ICO as well to report the loss of data. There are different levels. Again, within our security industry, authority licenses, SIA licenses, and SIA qualifications, the details of knowing what levels of data is under protection is not really a great concern to you. What you do need to know is obviously your role in data protection. Okay, holding personal data. There's certain rules and regulations that come with holding personal data on anybody or any organization. Personal data, obviously, is anything that can be used to identify somebody. Some of the rules and regulations involved in that are the data needs to be lawfully processed. The reason for having that data also needs to be lawful and adequate. The information collected needs to be to the point and not excessive as well. As mentioned before, data can only be held as long as is necessary, and it is up to the company to show reasons why the data needs to be held and how long that data needs to be held for. If data needs to be stored or transferred out of the country, this data needs to be very well protected. We've got some terms here. One of them is a data controller. A data controller is somebody who basically comes up with the reasons as to why they're holding the data, how they're going to hold the data, and how long they're going to hold the data for. Now, if you're going to look at something like a camera system, CCTV system in operation, for example, the data controller would be a person who decided that they were going to put cameras in operation in the first place, where they were going to position the cameras, how many cameras there were, and for what purpose these cameras have been installed. For example, for protection of staff, or for protection of public safety, prevention of crime and disorder, etc., etc. So they have to have the reasons. Then we have something that you might come across called the subject access request. Now, subject access request is if I know the data is being stored on me personally, I can ask for what that information is. So I have the right to ask for information that has been stored on me. Any company holding data has to respond to a subject access request, and one has to tell you where the data is being stored, and then they also have to disclose what data they are storing. Now, there are some exceptions to this. If it's deemed in national state security reasons why they cannot do that, cannot disclose that, then they would have to give you reasons for that. However, again, you working in security on our sort of standard level of security, working at a company, most likely chances are you would have to disclose that information. Again, maybe not you personally, but the company you work for would have to. So, for example, if I was caught shoplifting and somebody then reported me for shoplifting, let's say, I could then go to the security of the company and say, I want to see the evidence that you have on me for shoplifting. I can ask a subject access request, which they'd have to respond to say what information they hold on me, and they would have to share that information. Okay, one of the things we have to be very concerned about is discrimination. So you might mean to discriminate, but you also might discriminate without even realizing you're discriminating. Okay, so discrimination is basically where you take action against somebody based on a preconceived opinion. So as security, you need to be fair and treat everybody equally. Okay, you cannot pick on one person any more than you pick on somebody else. Every action you take needs to be justifiable and needs to be fair. A prejudice is having an idea about somebody without actually having any information. So whereas discrimination is based on action, a prejudice means you've got a feeling or you dislike somebody because of where they come from, their background, their race, their religion, etc. But you don't actually have any fact to back that. And stereotyping is where you put everybody into one group and then judge them by that. If we were to discriminate against somebody based on their appearance, for example, if I'm looking at a camera and I'm carrying out a tracking of a suspect potentially, or let's say not even a suspect, just a person, and I'm doing it just because they've got a hood up, essentially I'm carrying out tracking for no reason. Because they've got a hood up, I'm saying, oh, anyone with a hood is obviously a criminal. So we've got to be careful. So we don't want to directly discriminate or indirectly discriminate against any person or groups of people. Okay, it's very important that we remember that. And of course, if you do a CCTV course, or if you do another security course, the security guard or door supervision, that's still important to understand that you should not discriminate against anybody based on their appearance, their race, their ethnicity, their nationality, accents, etc., etc. So as mentioned before, discrimination is not only unethical, but it is also illegal, and it can land you in some severe issues with the law. Equal opportunities legislation actually protects people against discrimination. The Equalities Act of 2010 is the most recent of these bits of legislation, which has been amended a little bit left and right during the last few years, but it's the Equalities Act of 2010 that we mainly work under. We've also got the Sex Discrimination Act of 1975, which states that you cannot discriminate against somebody based on their gender. Also, we have the Disabilities Discrimination Act of 1995. This act states that you cannot basically discriminate against somebody because of their physical ability or mental ability. Then we have the Equal Pay Act of 1970. Now, this act states that any two people doing the same job should be paid the same amount. So it doesn't matter if you're male or female. If you are laying bricks in a house, you should get paid the exact same amount. Then we have a more difficult one. This is the age regulations. So we have the equality age regulations. Now, what this act states is that you cannot be discriminated against because of your age. Now, it's more of an upper age limit rather than a lower age limit. For example, if you were under 18 saying, I wanted to work in a bar, well, the law states that you cannot work in a bar if you're under the age of 18 without being supervised. So in that situation, that's not age discrimination, that's purely what the law says. However, if I was to say that I'm not going to employ you because you're too old here, and you don't fit with my young group of people working here, that then is age discrimination and is against the law. Very difficult to prove though, because if you're going for an interview, and let's say you're a little bit older, you're not necessarily going to know why they turned you down for the role. They might have had 20 other people being interviewed and they might have picked the best person for the role. However, what they can't do is they can't discriminate against you based on your age. One of the things that the newer legislation from 2006 states is that you no longer have to put your date of birth on your CV. So when you do your CV, you do not have to put your date of birth on there. In other words, you can leave out your date of birth entirely, so no one can sit and work out your age before you even get to an interview and completely get rid of you before you even get a chance to be interviewed. Any of the Equal Opportunities Acts can be enforced through the county courts and can result in fines being given to anybody who's found guilty. In other words, you might have to pay out damages to whoever the county court feels that you have discriminated against. The Commission for Racial Equality would deal with any complaints of any kind of racism or race discrimination. Lastly, we'll look at vicarious liability. Vicarious liability means that your company can be held responsible for the actions that you've taken. So any company can be held vicariously liable for the action of their staff. So if a member of staff is seen as discriminating, then what can happen is the fine can be charged to that member of staff plus the company that they represent as well. In other words, the fine to the company can be a lot higher than the fine to the individual. Also remember, you're licensed by the SIA, and if any of these things were to happen where you were found guilty of any type of discrimination, it could lead to your license being suspended or revoked. In this section, this is our health and safety section, so we're going to have a look at what that means for us in security. In the private security industry, obviously we deal with a lot of things, and one of those things we have to deal with is the element of health and safety. Not just for us, not just for our employees or our employers, but also for our customers or anybody visiting our site. Every year, hundreds of people die in the workplace in accidents that could have been avoided if simple health and safety had been taken into account. More than that, many thousands have time off work ill as well. The main act under health and safety that we work under is the Health and Safety at Work Act of 1974. This act covers pretty much everybody and anybody inside your premises at any given time. This includes anybody unlawfully on the site as well. So if somebody were to break into the property and fall down and injure themselves, technically they would be covered under health and safety. Now, that doesn't mean that if they injure themselves breaking in that they'd be covered, but let's say that you had an open trapdoor which was unmarked and they fell down and broke their leg, there is a good chance that they could put a claim in against you for that. Just like the ICO and the SIA, the HSE deal with everything relating to health and safety. So any breaches of health and safety, breaching of the Act, if we go back to what we discussed earlier on law, we would realize that a breach of health and safety is in fact a breach of an Act of Parliament, which means it is a criminal offence as opposed to a civil matter. Now, there can be a civil element to this because obviously if I break my leg, I could then sue a company that I worked for, but I could also end up in a situation where I am going to court in a situation where I've had my leg injured and it's a criminal conviction that they're going for against owners, managers, etc., because I was not correctly trained. I wasn't given any protective equipment, etc., etc. If that's found to be a fact, then the owners of the company can be held responsible for that and can end up with a criminal conviction against them. The maximum penalty for breach of health and safety can be up to 2 years imprisonment and an unlimited fine. All right, responsibilities of the employer. So your boss that you work for has a responsibility for the health and safety of all their employees, as well as anybody affected by that employee's acts and omissions. So if I was to, say, injure somebody, but then I could show that I was never fully trained in how to carry out, say, an ejection correctly, then that would fall on me, but it would also fall on the company vicariously, and they may be then taken to court over any injury sustained to that customer. So your employer has a duty of care. They have to provide you with safe equipment, training, safe access and egress to buildings. They have to make sure that you're trained in fire safety, make sure you're trained in evacuation. And all these things are very important because it doesn't just affect you, it affects your customers as well. Depending where you work, there may be a health and safety written policy and even a safety committee. Responsibility of the employee. Now, as an employee, you're also responsible for your own actions and your omissions as well. So things you do and things you don't do. It's very easy to just blame your boss for it, but in fact, if you have been trained on how to do something and then you choose not to do it correctly or not wear the corrective gear, you then can get yourself into trouble, either by getting yourself fired potentially, disciplined, or potentially, in more severe cases, getting yourself taken to court over breaches of health and safety. So your number one priority in anything is yourself. So ideally, you've got to take care of your own health and safety. So if somebody asks you to do something and you deem that thing to be unsafe, then you need to tell them, no, under health and safety, I cannot do this. Again, within reason, if you have been trained and you are equipped to do it, then obviously that's part of your job, then you would do it. But if, on the other hand, you've never been trained and you feel unsafe in doing something, then you have to raise an objection to doing it. Better would be to actually raise that objection in writing as well. So your job is to look after your own health and safety, use your training, attend all training, wear your personal protective equipment, and don't do anything unsafe. Okay, let's have a look at risk assessment. So risk assessment is where I have a look at a room, for example, and I look out for things called hazards. Now, if I look out for a hazard, what I'm looking for is something that has the potential to cause harm. So a hazard is anything that has the potential to cause harm. A risk is the percentage chance of that hazard causing harm. So, for example, if I have a chair blocking a fire exit, the chances of that causing harm in an emergency are very high. If the chair is tucked away in a corner, although it's still potentially a trip hazard, the risk of somebody falling over it is quite low. A staircase would always be classed as a hazard because there's the potential to cause harm. People could fall down and hurt themselves. A staircase can never be removed, but what we can do is reduce the risk of harm by making sure it is well lit, by making sure it has handrails, non-slip flooring, people aren't blocking it, etc., etc. So a risk assessment is identifying hazards, quantifying the risks, and taking measures to reduce the risks to an acceptable level. Good health and safety practice is all about reducing risk to an acceptable level. As I said, if we can reduce hazards, we do, but in certain cases we're not able to do so. In the case of the stairs, or even in the case of a lift, that is always going to be a hazard, but you don't have a way around that if you're working on the 10th story of a building. So 5 steps to a risk assessment is: number 1, identify hazards. Number 2, identify those who could be harmed. Number 3, take measures to reduce the risk of somebody being harmed. Number 4, record the findings. And number 5, review as necessary. So some of the typical things you might come across in everyday working environment, which would be seen as potential hazards, would be things like blocked fire exits, blocked staircases, bad lighting outside a venue, slippery floors, wet floors with no signage up, all of these kind of things in a venue where you're working where there's glass. It could potentially even be a broken glass on the floor which hasn't been collected. This is now a hazard because someone could step on that and injure themselves. Some of the things we control, especially working in say, a licensed venue, a nightclub or pub or something like that, is we actually control the numbers coming in. Overcrowding is a serious risk and can be very dangerous involving too many people in a small space, can be very, very dangerous, and in fact can even cause fatalities in extreme circumstances. So we have to control the numbers coming in. Now, quite often we'll be guided as to how many people are allowed in a premises, especially if it's a licensed premises. It would be part of that venue's license as to how many people are allowed in. However, building regulations will always be the number one. Building regulations would state how many people could fit in any space inside the building. And that's calculated on how many exits there are and how long it would take people to safely exit that building in an emergency. Now, you may have heard the term PPE before. Well, PPE stands for Personal Protective Equipment. Personal protective equipment is anything that can be used to protect yourself or others from harm. So this could be anything from high visibility clothing, steel toe cap boots if you're working in an environment which requires you to protect your shoes, gloves for either searching or cold weather operations. This could also involve anything like headwear, helmets, eye protection, hearing protection, radios, mobile phones, torches. All of these things come under personal protective equipment. So just remember, PPE stands for personal protective equipment and is anything which helps protect you from either your environment, your surroundings, help light the environment around you, and just basically keep you safe. Other dangers you can come across are things like bodily fluid, blood, vomit, these kind of things. Again, working in certain environments, you might come across this more often than not. And of course, needles. If you're working in an environment where you have to do patrols and you come across something like a used needle, what you need to be very sure about is that you don't touch it ever with your hands. What you need to do is firstly be trained in how to handle that. And if you are trained, you would use normally a litter picker to pick it up so you make no physical contact. Remember also, disposing of such waste has to be followed very strict precautions. You have to follow strict precautions when disposing of such waste, such as you cannot take a needle and throw it in a dustbin. It has to go in a sharps box. Any needles or blades always have to go in a sharps box to protect anybody else involved, i.e. The refuse collection company comes in to take away the rubbish, and if there's a needle in the bag, there's a chance that the person picking up that bag can then get stabbed with a needle. Sharps boxes are generally a yellow in color. Yellow denotes a hazard, and obviously any needles or sharps inside that box then are very clearly visible as being hazards. Other dangers are things such as manual handling. Now, manual handling includes moving anything with any weight, including a person. So if you're not trained on how to move a person, you can end up causing yourself injury as well as potentially causing them injury. If you do a door supervision course, you'll be trained on how to escort people according to SIA protocols. If you are manhandling or moving any object, it is very important that you protect your back. Back injuries can be long-lasting, and you may need an awful lot of work to get back on your feet again. Safe lifting techniques. So the most important thing with a safe lifting technique is to make sure that you're balanced, your feet are shoulder width apart, and you bend your knees and you keep your back as straight as you possibly can. If you bend your back, you're putting a lateral load on the spine, which can cause damage such as ruptured discs, herniated discs, etc. And if you get one of those, this can be an awful lot of surgery that you'll need to repair you. It can also be very, very long-lasting effects on you. So you've got to be careful when carrying anything heavy. And if you're uncomfortable, the first thing you want to ask is does it have to be moved at all? When looking at any load, do you have to manually move it, or can equipment be used? Is there an alternative to having to move this load yourself? Now, looking at sort of a fairly favorite section as far as the exam is concerned, and that is the colors of the signs. So health and safety signage. It's important that you know these colors for your workplace. It's very important that you know what each sign means. So under health and safety, all signs are color-coded to give you a better idea of what they mean from potentially a little bit of a distance away. So a prohibition sign is a very common sign that you may see. And a prohibition sign means that you are prohibited from doing whatever the sign denotes. So in other words, if you see a cigarette with a red circle around it with a red line going through the middle, that would be denoting that you cannot smoke. So prohibition means you cannot. It is red with a white background and normally a picture inside showing what you can't do. The next sign that we look at is a warning sign. Now normally the warning signs are going to come in a triangle in shape, not always, but most generally they'll have a triangle on it somewhere. They will be yellow with black outline and black writing. Now this is a warning, and normally it'll tell you underneath what the warning is. It might be danger high voltage, it might be a dangerous shock, it might be danger of sharp objects, etc., etc. It could be one of many things, but as I said, it's a yellow sign, triangular in size, triangular in shape with black writing. The next sign that we'll look at is the mandatory sign. Mandatory sign means something you must comply with. So kind of the opposite of the prohibition sign. Prohibition meaning you can't, mandatory meaning you must. So for example, if you see a fire door, it will generally say fire door keep shut, and that is a must. You must comply with this sign. Then we have safe condition signs. These are green signs with white writing. Normally found on fire exits as well as your first aid kits. Then we've got fire equipment signs. These are normally red signs with white writing, and they're normally around your fire equipment. It could be anything from a fire blanket to your fire extinguishers. We also have hazardous chemical signs, normally found wherever hazardous chemicals are stored, so cleaning equipment. Also things like HGVs carrying chemicals with them. They'll normally have signage on the back, which will also have a telephone number, emergency telephone number, explaining to you which number to call if the truck, say, has an accident. Okay, so very basic bit of first aid here. We're just going to go through some very basic bits as far as first aid is concerned. So primarily what we need to remember is you're not going to be a doctor, and we're not training you to be a doctor. We're training you to give first aid as quickly as possible and as thoroughly as possible before the emergency services arrive. Okay, so our first thing we always want to remember is the number one priority is ourselves. So we want to make sure that we are safe. Okay, secondary to that, of course, is our casualty. So our casualty, what we're trying to do is we're trying to put them in a position where they can recover, where they don't deteriorate any further, and of course we can give basic life support if we need to. So the main aims of first aid are preservation of life, prevent deterioration, and promote a natural recovery. We're not allowed to give them any form of drugs at all. So in other words, I can't give them, even if somebody came up to me and said, I've got a headache, please can I have a painkiller? I'm not allowed legally to give that to them. I can put that down and see what happens if they take it themselves. However, I can never put something in their hand. Okay, so we've got to be very careful with that. What we can do is we can assist somebody by helping them with their own medication that they brought with them. We cannot start diagnosing people and start giving them medication from our point of view. Under health and safety law, all employers need to provide adequate training as well as facilities for first aid under the legislation. As mentioned before, our number one priority is checking that it's safe for us. So we work under a Dr. ABC, which is a little acronym we use, and the D stands for danger. So the first thing we want to do is check for danger to make sure that the area is safe for us to give first aid. Then we would ask for response, see if the patient is responsive to us. Then we're going to go to airway, breathing, circulation. We'd also check for any fluids such as blood around the body, and of course any heavy bleeds, we would try and control that bleed as quickly as possible to prevent the patient going into shock. Now, if you are a first aider on site, you need to know what your responsibilities are. You need to know where your kit is, and it's your responsibility also, if you do use that kit, to make sure that any stock used up is replenished. You're also responsible for writing all reports subsequent to any first aid situation. So if I was to give first aid to somebody, my first priority is me, second priority is the patient, and then lastly is the follow-up after the incident is over. And this includes writing all reports, filling out your accident book, and passing on any information to any of the authorities that would require it. Under HSE regulations, all first aid kit needs to be airtight. It needs to be green with a white cross. and it needs to be adequately stocked and replenished if stocks are used. Remember also, calling 999 or 112 in an emergency promptly is very important. The sooner you call, the sooner help can get to them. Now, when you deal with a emergency operator, they will have a checklist which they will go through with you. Obviously, who you are, where you're calling from, and the nature of the emergency will be the first few items on that checklist that they'll go through with you. They will then continue to work through this checklist, making sure that the patient is making sure if the patient is breathing, are they conscious, what is the nature of the injury or illness, etc., etc. So they'll go through that with you. Your job is to stay calm and keep the patient calm if they are conscious as well, because that goes a long way to prevent shock. As mentioned already, post-incident, your job will be to fill out all relevant paperwork and all report writing as well. One of the areas you may need to report to is RIDDOR. RIDDOR is Reporting of Injuries, Diseases and Dangerous Occurrences Regulations, 2013. There are certain illnesses and injuries as well as close calls that need to be reported under RIDDOR regulations. You can go to RIDDOR online and you can have a look at what would need to be reported. But essentially it's serious injuries that require hospitalization, extended time off work, and things of that nature. Close calls are actually also required to be reported. So if we had scaffolding collapse and it fell down but no one was injured, it would still be reportable under RIDDOR. The employer must also report any serious accidents and injuries in the workplace to the local authority as well as the HSE and potentially RIDDOR. Fire safety awareness. In this section, we're going to be going through all the fire safety that you need to know. This includes how fires can start, how they burn. We'll also include some videos. We'll also talk about the fire extinguishers, types of extinguishers, what kind of fires they put out, so what you should use on what kind of fire. We'll also talk about the 3 elements of a fire. So let's get started. Obviously, it goes without saying that fire is bad. We don't really want to have fire where we're working, and prevention is better than cure. Pretty much, it could not be better said than that. So fire in the workplace causes major disruption, damage, millions of pounds worth of damage potentially in a very short amount of time. And of course, could cause injury and death in certain circumstances. So the key here is to prevent the fire from starting in the first place. As a security officer, we need to have some basic knowledge on fire. We need to know what our fire prevention methods are, what to do in the event of a fire, our evacuation routes, and who to inform if a fire was to break out. With the 3 elements of fire, which are heat, oxygen, and fuel, most extinguishers would deal with either the heat or the oxygen elements of the fire. The fuel itself is what's burning. So if it's wood, paper, cloth, or something like that, nothing can really be done about that. But what we can do is we can cool the fire, so remove the heating element, and thus the fire should cease to burn. So basic fire prevention. Number 1 cause of fire is litter. Litter around, it's the number 1 thing that you can control. So stopping a buildup of litter, dry waste lying about, making sure it's disposed of properly. And then of course you've got wiring, faulty electrical wiring, etc. Any kind of faulty electrical wiring and cabling can of course cause a fire as well. So it's very important we also understand where stored energy is kept and what precautions to take around stored energy. Stored energy are things like gas canisters, things like that. If you discover any faulty equipment where you work, it's vitally important that you report that to a member of the management team as quick as possible. It's also important that you notify them in writing, or at least have some sort of written evidence that you've done this. In the event of a fire occurring later, and no one's taken care of whatever the condition or problem was, it can be pushed back to you. So it's important that you have written proof that you have in fact reported this fault to somebody. Also, the electrical equipment needs to be tested regularly, so PAT testing needs to be done, normally on an annual basis for anything that is older than a year old. Waste needs to be regularly removed from the site as well, and any combustible material should be kept to a minimum. Us as security can prevent fires quite easily by simply implementing basic fire safety protocols and procedures. Under health and safety and fire safety regulations, your employer must nominate a competent person to go and do a fire safety course. They would normally then become the fire warden for the building or floor or company that you work for. And their job will be to assist in evacuations. In security, that generally will be you. And not only assisting in the evacuations, but then handing information across to the fire safety services, fire department, whichever fire department you happen to have where you live or work. Also, your company needs to make sure that they do a fire risk assessment, and the fire risk assessment is documented. As usual, all companies need to make sure that their employees have information, instruction and guidance on what to do in an emergency as well. Okay, now a very common question that you're probably going to come across in the exam is going to be talking about classes of fire. So we have a number of different classes of fire, and each one's designated a letter. So I'll quickly go through those with you so that you can see what they are. They're quite important to remember, as you're most likely going to get questions on them in the exam. Okay, so we start off with Class A. Now, a Class A fire is simply a fire that has any solid materials. That could be cloth, that could be wood, that could be paper, that could be anything like that that's burning. That's a solid material. Class B is liquids. Now, this is referring to things like petrol and things like that, thinners, spirits, all of that kind of stuff. That would come under a Class B fire. A Class C fire is a gas fire, and a gas fire is any fire which it has gas involved in it. So anything like butane or any other kind of gas like that. Class D is metals. Metals do burn. Under the right temperatures, metal will burn. So Class D fire would have metals burning. Aluminium, for example. Class F. Class F fire denotes a fire that is fat or oil-based, meaning that the fat or oil is actually what's burning. Okay, so that's a Class F fire. Now, the one that I've skipped is some people refer to as a Class E fire, but that's actually not correct, because a Class E fire would mean that the electricity itself is burning, and it's not. It's actually just called an electrical fire. So there is no such thing as a Class E fire, it's just called an electrical fire. An electrical fire just means electricity is involved. Electricity doesn't burn itself, but if it's involved, say in a solid fire, a Class A fire, that would change the type of extinguisher that we'd want to use. We wouldn't want to use, say, a water extinguisher, which is what we would usually use on a Class A fire, because if there's electricity involved, there's a high chance of us getting electrocuted if we were to do that. Now that we've gone through the classes of fire, let's go through the extinguishers as well. Another very common question in the exam. So the first extinguisher we'll look at is a water extinguisher. Now, a water extinguisher is a red extinguisher, as most of the extinguishers are. They most have a red body, but this one will have a red label as well. Now, the red label means it's a water extinguisher. The extinguisher is used for Class A fires, so that's solid fuel fires only. Solid fuels being your wood, your paper, your cloth, those kind of fires, textile fires. So that is a Class A fire, and that is a water extinguisher to be used in a Class A fire. Okay, then we also have to worry about how does it work. So a water extinguisher works by simply cooling down the fire, removing the heat element. So remember, you have the three elements: heat, fuel, and oxygen. Well, a water extinguisher removes the heat element from the fire. The next extinguisher is a very common extinguisher, which is our CO2 extinguisher. CO2 extinguisher is a carbon dioxide extinguisher. It is a red extinguisher, normally red body, as they all are, with a black label. And the black label denotes that it's a CO2 extinguisher. This means that it's carbon dioxide. It's normally used on a Class B fire, as well as an electrical fire. So Class B fire meaning a liquid fire, so not fat, but things like spirits and gasoline type fires, and an electrical fire. Any fire like that I said to you earlier, we can't use a water extinguisher on because of the electricity involved. We would use a CO2 extinguisher. Please note the CO2 extinguisher is also able to be used on multiple different fires. However, the recommendation is just Class B and electrical. You could use it on a Class A fire, however, because of the force of the extinguisher, itself, as you're discharging it, it can actually blast the sort of light bits of paper around and cause multiple fires actually, instead of extinguishing what we wanted to extinguish. Next we have a foam extinguisher. The foam extinguisher is a cream label, and this is for use on class A and B fires. The foam extinguisher works by removing the oxygen by placing a layer of foam on top, as well as cooling by using the water element of the extinguisher. Unlike the CO2 extinguisher, which simply removes the oxygen from the fire. Now we're on to the powder extinguisher, a very versatile extinguisher. It comes with a blue label, and it's actually able to be used on most fires that you come across. However, there are some health and safety aspects with it, some issues with small space, small environments. Outdoors also, it's less effective because of the spread, but very versatile in the sense that it can be used on most types of fire. A, B, C, D, and electrical. It can be used on all of these. But as I said, there are a few health and safety aspects with it involved in your breathing in a small space, as well as ingestion can cause issues for you. So you won't see too many of these around these days. Most of the time now we see these confined to outdoor petrol stations, etc. Wet chemical. Wet chemical extinguisher is used in kitchens mainly. It's mainly used for fat fires. Can be used on a class A fire as well, but it's mainly used on class F fires. It's got a yellow label, and what it does is it actually alters the state of the fat. It chemically changes the state of the fat and turns it into some kind of soapy kind of emulsion. So it no longer burns. Then we have something that's common to most kitchens, and that is a fire blanket. Fire blanket simply acts by taking the oxygen element away and smothering the fire. This will work on any kind of confined fire. Again, mainly fat fires because they're in a saucepan. You'd place the blanket over, and you would not remove it until the emergency services, the fire department, arrive and say it's safe to do so. Then, of course, you get in some buildings, you'll get a fire hose, which is simply just a water extinguisher with a lot more capacity than a normal water standard extinguisher that you can transport around with you, so a portable one. So this is obviously a lot more water involved in it, and again can be used. It's not only for firefighters, it can be used by general public or staff, as long as they're trained on how to use it. But essentially it's for use with a class A fire. So coming back to our basics, we need to understand what to do in an emergency. Well, the first thing is to recognize what is an emergency. We have to recognize what the fire alarm looks like, what it sounds like, what a fire alarm control panel is, where that might be. Now, all of this would be passed on to you when you're training to work at a specific environment or in a specific environment. So they would train you to deal with the fire evacuation procedures, exactly what your role is in that procedure, what area you have to be in charge of to keep clear or to move people through. Also, how to read the fire control panel so you know exactly which area of the building is affected. A fire control panel will basically show you exactly which area of the building, if you're in a large building, is affected by the sensors going off. So it will give you a normally red flashing light where the sensor is that's going off, which will be in a zone of the building which you should then recognize. Okay, now firefighting is not recommended to someone who's not trained and equipped to do so. What you need to understand is that a fire will spread rapidly and quite often can overcome you very, very quickly without you realizing it. It can trap you when you're too busy looking in one direction. You don't realize that fire is moving and potentially blocking your exit. The other thing is what's burning. You need to be aware of what is burning around you and what you're now breathing in. So not only can you burn your lungs through breathing in some very hot air, but also you're breathing in a lot of noxious air as well, a lot of toxins coming into you off paint, fabrics, etc. And these can cause major damage. So we only fight a fire if it's smaller than a waste paper bin size. It does not take more than one extinguisher. If you use up an extinguisher, you then evacuate. You do not try and attempt to get a second extinguisher to go and fight the fire further. What you want to do is then get yourself and others to safety as quickly as possible. You need to know your exits, you need to know your fire evacuation drills, and you need to know how to get out safely as quickly as possible. With gas and metal fires, it's not recommended that you get involved at all. In fact, the recommendation from the fire department is that you evacuate to a safe area. Normally with stored energy, that area might be quite far away from the actual fire itself for safety. because stored energy, obviously, if those things were to explode due to the heating, they can cause massive amounts of damage, and there's an awful lot of force involved in those situations. Simply put, if you're in doubt, get out. Right, so operating an extinguisher. Well, I have a small extinguisher here, so I can demonstrate very briefly. What we have here is we have a very small powder extinguisher. Probably not that useful in any kind of large fire because you're going to run out of powder pretty quick. You can see here the blue label. You can also see just over here is a safety mechanism. Now this is a safety pin which you would pull out in order to fire the extinguisher itself. So in order to remove the pin, I would simply pull that pin out and then I could squeeze down and that would trigger the fire extinguisher. Now I'm not going to pull the pin out because it's actually safety enhanced and it's been inspected, which is what this little rubber thing around it is here, and what that is just showing us it's been serviced. Most extinguishers of the powdered variety, also the CO2, will quite often have, as well as water, will quite often have a pressure gauge, which will also show you that there is sufficient powder or water or whatever left in the extinguisher, and it should be in the green band. Fire safety checks. Now, fire safety checks would be something you do on a regular basis. This is something you do when you start a shift. You'll be making sure your fire doors are not blocked. There's no one or nothing obstructing these doors. They're not being used as a storage area. They're unlocked as well, and they're clearly marked. Now, even if we've got emergency lighting, so if we had a power failure, the emergency lighting should still light up for our fire exits. Now, there's a fire exit and a fire door. A fire door is something that should be kept shut and locked at all times. Now, I say locked, I mean secured at all times. The reason being that we should still be able to move through them freely, but they should always shut behind us. The reason being that obviously it slows fire down and it stops the spread of smoke, or slows the spread of smoke as well if a fire is started. If we had all the doors and windows open, all that would happen is the fire keeps getting fed oxygen. What we're trying to do is prevent that fire from getting excessive amounts of oxygen. So we're trying to let the fire almost choke itself out. Another thing we need to be careful of as well is our occupancy numbers, and making sure that from building regulations point of view, we haven't breached our occupancy figures. So evacuation is very important. Remember, the definition of evacuation is the swift and safe removal of people or property from an endangered area. Now, property comes a very distant second to people. We need to make sure that we get our people out as quickly as possible. Remember also, never return to a building if the building's in danger for any reason. Once you're out, you're out. It's now for the professionals to go back in and look to help people. All you would do by going back into a building that is burning is cause the fire department to have to look for another casualty. The chances of you getting in and out again are very low. Also, as part of the evacuation procedure, we need to be prepared to assist anybody who's potentially more vulnerable. So that could be youngsters, it could be elderly people, it could be somebody who's perhaps disabled. Any of these people, we need to be sure that we're able to assist them on their way out. Also remember, you might be dealing with people who are drinking, and they may be drunk, and they may also be impaired due to that. So we might need to help them out as well. Also, people who are drinking may have less of a sense of danger, so it's up to us to make sure that these people do evacuate safely. We don't want to cause them to panic, because that can cause more danger, but we also don't want them sort of standing there looking at the fire and not taking it very seriously. I think we're all guilty at times of hearing a fire alarm go off and thinking it's some kind of drill. The important thing is we're there to direct people and explain to them it's not a drill, and we need them to move quickly and safely towards the exits. Remember, as with all things, prior planning and preparation prevent poor performance. So you have to plan ahead for these things. You cannot go into a fire situation without any knowledge. You may work in an industry as a security operative where you are constantly moving from site to site. It's very important that you understand each site may have a slightly different fire evacuation process and procedure, and you need to understand each one and know your fire evacuation points and what you need to do in an emergency. Remember to always report any fire hazards, be fire safety conscious, always act promptly in an emergency, and never assume anything is a drill. We now move on to the final module, which is emergency procedures. It follows on quite well from fire, because obviously fire is an emergency, and a lot of the procedures that we've learned about in fire are going to simply come across into the other emergencies that we're going to look at. The definition of an emergency is pretty straightforward. It's any unforeseen incident that is so serious that it demands immediate action. So that is something that is unforeseen and sudden, that we have to react to, and we have to react to quickly, because if we fail to do so, things could go very bad very quickly. Some of the types of emergency that you might come across are anything from fire, which we spoke about before, to floods, to power loss, because that can be an emergency in certain buildings, certain situations, to bomb threats, to some kind of suspicious device or suspect package. First aid will also fall under an emergency, as in we have to deliver first aid immediately. As usual, going back to everything we've learned so far, with an emergency, priority is for life first. So people come first, property comes very far down the line as a second. We always want to look after ourselves as number one, and then everybody else is number two. So we're number one priority, everybody else is number two. In the event of most emergencies we come across, our number one thing to do is raise the alarm. Just with fire, raising the alarm is very, very important, because we're raising the alarm, we're getting that ball rolling with our colleagues to potentially get the emergency services involved whilst we start an evacuation procedure, and in a fire scenario, perhaps attempt to extinguish. We wouldn't try and extinguish a fire and then raise the alarm. We would raise the alarm first as a priority, then try and fight the fire, and then evacuate. As with most emergencies, if you have a casualty, a patient who's hurt themselves, somebody's fallen over and hurt themselves, our number one thing to do in that situation would be to raise the alarm. Then we go and help, because again, if they're in a situation where they've been badly hurt, we want to make sure that they get help first from the professionals as quickly as possible. So whilst we can assist them up to a point, the professionals will do a much better job than we will. Gas leaks. With a gas leak, the most important thing is that nobody should smoke. These days, obviously with smoke-free environments and the law as it is, most environments will be smoke-free, so that should be okay on that front. What we also need to make sure is we evacuate the site to a safe area, and even in that place restrict smoking, because depending on the concentration of the gas, it could still be highly flammable even in the air. The next thing to do would be call the fire department. With most gas leaks, the fire department needs to be called, because they'll need to carry out an operation of finding out where the leak's coming from, and getting air into the area, and reducing the concentration of gas. Remember, gas is flammable, but it's also very noxious. So if you breathe too much of it in, you can suffer from carbon monoxide poisoning, which can be fatal. If we're ever working somewhere where we can come across something like an RTI, or road traffic incident, this is where potentially a car has crashed into potentially another car, a pedestrian, a cyclist, or anything like that. Our number one priority, again, is our own safety. We need to make sure, if we're going to go into the street to try and help, that it is safe for us to do so. We don't want to go rushing into the street and then become a casualty ourselves, because we were not careful about rushing in. Violent situations are normally dealt with by calling the police. We would also need to carry out any restraints, which would be taught if you were going to go and do a door supervision course, carrying out SIA regulated restraints on people, and potentially escorting them or detaining them for the police. Serious crimes, as mentioned before, obviously the priority there is to call the police, and of course preservation of evidence. Now, if we can detain somebody safely, then we would do so, but we would only do so if it was safe to do so. We wouldn't put ourselves or other customers at risk to do so. In order to maintain our safety, if we have to let the person go, then we let the person go. If we have any evidence, we would then hand that across to the police to assist them further with their investigation. Okay, now coming on to something that is very serious, which is bomb threats and suspect packages. Now, in this day and age, we've got to take any threat very seriously, whether that's phoned in, which is less likely today, or whether we've seen something, spotted something either on camera or in person, which we seem to think is a potential to be a device of some kind. Now we've got to be very aware that these devices can be quite crude. They can be spotted quite simply by seeing wires coming out of a bag, things like that. What we don't want to do though is get too close to investigate it. You certainly don't want to go up to a device or potential device and give it a kick or anything like this. We want to straight away evacuate the site, make sure that the area is clear. However, take a few steps back. If it's just a bag and it's just a discarded bag, probably the best thing to do first is to find out, does anybody own this bag? Before you start calling for the police and the bomb squad, you want to find out, has somebody just forgotten their bag there? So it could very well be that somebody's just forgotten their items. So the first thing you want to do is just call out, excuse me, has anybody lost a bag? If we get no response at that point, then we would cordon the area off and we would move ourselves and our customers to safety. We would stay away from using any mobile devices, phones and radios, because that could trigger the device. You certainly would want to move the device. It may have a trip switch inside, which may cause a device to trigger. Okay, terrorism, that's a hot subject, unfortunately, today, obviously, all over the world, and we've had our fair share here in the UK. Our key here is to be vigilant at all times. Okay, intelligence gathering is our best defense. If you see something that doesn't look right, there are a couple of options you have. You can report it to the counterterrorism hotline, which is a number you can call 0800 789 321. That's 0800 789 321. That number is a number you would call if you see something that doesn't look right. This is a non-emergency number and it's an intelligence gathering number. So the police will then look at that evidence, they'll look at the different pieces of the puzzle, and they will put those together potentially and see a pattern that then would help them with a subsequent investigation and potential arrest of somebody before they go ahead and try and commit an attack or an act of terrorism. It's very important to understand that once that attack starts, our job is again safety. So if it's anything like somebody running around stabbing somebody or something like that, which we've seen in the last few years, we would be again getting our customers indoors somewhere safe and closing and securing the venue inside. That would have to be dealt with by the police. Okay, so we've got different types of terrorist groups. We could have international and we could have domestic. So today it's a lot easier with social media for a terrorist group to indoctrinate somebody into their beliefs and potentially into doing something. Also, terrorism today is quite far removed from what it was even 5-10 years ago. Now all you need is the internet. Having watched a few videos, you get yourself in a mindset where you think you're going to make a difference and you're going to go out there and hurt a lot of people. Vehicles are used, very crude weapons are used, knives, things like that. And it doesn't take a huge organization like it might have done 15 or 10 years ago. It's now quite simply somebody with an internet connection just jumping in a car and running over as many people as they possibly can. So this is what we're up against, and this is why the intelligence gathering is so very important. A terrorist today is most likely going to be indiscriminate in targeting. However, they might target a specific group of people or a specific site, or they may be indiscriminate and just happen to target anyone or anything that happens to be in the area where they are at the time. So in security, it's very important that we pay attention to what's happening around the world and especially in our particular area. If we're working near to or we're involved with anything that may be a target, perhaps there's a big event on with a lot of people around, there's a lot of spectators, and there's a lot of members of the public around. These are the things that a terrorist would probably go for. So we need to be very vigilant in these situations and look out for anything that looks strange. And this includes anybody coming before an incident, perhaps a week, perhaps two, perhaps even a month before, who looks to be taking pictures and carrying out something we call hostile reconnaissance. So hostile reconnaissance is where they're looking for weaknesses in our security and areas they can exploit in order to carry out a terrorist activity. Okay, so we've also got a question that comes up quite regularly, and that is the terrorism threat levels. So there's 5 threat levels, although we only ever really use 3. We start off at the bottom, and that is the low threat level. Now that is, as it suggests, it is a very low threat, so a terrorist activity is low and an attack is highly unlikely. Then we move to moderate, where an attack is possible but not likely. Then we move to substantial. Now substantial means an attack is a strong possibility. Then we move to severe, an attack is highly likely. And then lastly, we move to critical, where an attack is expected imminently. Now, critical is normally based on intelligence gathered. In other words, we're expecting an attack to actually happen based on actual intelligence gathered. A critical threat level is normally maintained for quite a short amount of time, whilst the attack is either ongoing or it has just occurred, or intelligence is very strong that an attack is about to occur. The reason it was done for such a short period of time is it's very expensive to stay on a critical threat level due to the amount of police that have to be immediately available. The emergency services have to be immediately available, including the army potentially, as well as all the other armed services. So critical is only used in extreme situations. But we have in the recent years had a few incidents where we've had a critical threat level. As mentioned, the counterterrorism hotline is 0800 789 321, and that's the number to dial in order to pass intelligence on to the police. In an emergency, our usual numbers are 999 or 112. One of the keys in our role is counterterrorism, and in order to carry out counterterrorism, we need to be vigilant. We need to be switched on. We need to know our area. We need to know what our weaknesses are and try to minimize those weaknesses. We need to patrol the site. We need to make sure that these patrols are in no way monitored, and if they are, they're completely random, so there's no pattern there for somebody to spot and again look for a weakness. We need to also use good physical security as well, so that means having good locks and secure building, secure site, which you'd have to have the right authority to access. Having good CCTV and good systems of operation, good access and egress control, all of these things will help act as a major deterrent, as well as help in gathering evidence in the situation where terrorism is a possibility. Something that's not as common anymore as it might have been maybe 20, 25 years ago is a bomb threat telephone call. Now, these things have become less common in more modern times. However, you should still have a bomb threat checklist which you can go through if someone were to phone a bomb threat through. The first thing, the most important thing obviously to remember, is that this is something that needs to be taken seriously, and you definitely don't want to treat it as a joke or not take it seriously at all. So you would try and listen out for things, listen out for signs in the background, any background noise when a person's making a threat call through to you. Gather as much information as you can, ask them who they're representing, etc., etc. Now, if somebody's phoning through a bomb threat, they may be representing an organization, and they wouldn't be too scared to tell you, because most terrorist organizations are quite quick to claim responsibility for an act. Suspect packages. We could come across a variety of suspect packages, anything from high explosives left in crudely manufactured to quite complex manufactured weapons. IEDs, which are improvised explosive devices, essentially homemade bombs, which again can be quite crude and can fail, or they can be deadly accurate and very successful in causing mass carnage and devastation to people and property. So bombs can come in many shapes and sizes, anything from a package to a car bomb to a person-borne device, a suicide bomber, which again in recent times has become far more popular, where a person will wear either a backpack or perhaps a vest, enter a very, very densely populated area, and then detonate themselves in that area when it's the most crowded that it can be. So with a person-borne device, obviously, there's not an awful lot we can do physically, clearing everybody away, and of course our intelligence gathering beforehand is key to our safety in this situation. There is, of course, chemical bombs and chemical agents which can also be used, and these can be used from time to time to either attack somebody individually, or perhaps attack a group of people, as we've seen in some parts of the world in the not too distant past. So nerve agents, chemical weapons, biological weapons can also be used. Again, going back to suspect package, do's and don'ts, the most important thing to do is to find out, does anybody own it? If not, we clear the area, evacuate the site, call the emergency services immediately, make sure your mobile phone and your radios are switched off so that we don't in any way, shape or form accidentally trigger the device. We don't lift it, kick it, push it, touch it, none of those things. You want to stay away from it, and if it turns out that it is nothing, that is not your fault. That is for the emergency services to determine, and you cannot be too cautious with this kind of stuff. You're not going to get into trouble if it turns out to be somebody's dirty laundry. However, you don't want to chance it and risk a lot of people's lives, including your own, and treat it as nothing when it turns out to be something that could be quite deadly. Things to look out for as far as suspect behavior is concerned. Most important thing to look out for is people trying to take pictures of our security measures. Now, they could use mobile phones and they can try and act like they're talking on the phone or looking at something. Meanwhile, they're taking either film footage or video footage or still footage of maybe our cameras, our access and egress, our entry and exits of our buildings, and any security around it. Now, if that were to happen, we want to get them on camera as quickly as possible and perhaps challenge them. What we also need to remember is that legally, if they're in public space, they're allowed to take pictures of public buildings. If they're inside our building, we can challenge and we can stop them from taking pictures. All we can do if they're taking pictures of our building, if we're in a public space, is we can challenge them and ask them what they're taking pictures for, what the reasons for that are, and perhaps just let them know that we know that they're there. Things to look out for with suspicious behavior would be anybody trying to disguise their identity on entry or exit of a building or wherever they see cameras. So if they kind of glance up at a camera and then try and cover their face with a hood or something like that, this is a prime indicator that they don't want to be seen on camera. It might be that they've done something or they're about to do something. Either way, if you're a camera operator, you want to probably pay attention to this and take note of the time and the date in case something happens down the line, or in case a report comes to you that something has happened a little earlier, maybe a little bit away, and this could be the suspect that the police are looking for.